Hello and welcome to our online wine course on the wines of Bordeaux. Let us have a look where Bordeaux is located. Bordeaux is on the western coast of France, on the Atlantic Ocean, and the department is called Nouvelle-Aquitaine. The wine region Bordeaux itself is named after the city Bordeaux and is by the French also referred to as Bordelais. Internationally, it is known as Bordeaux. When we have a look once again on the French map to get an overview of all French wine regions, we see that in a lot of French departments there is viticulture, except for some northern areas such as Normandy, and there is less wine growing and viticulture in the center of France, which is Le Massif Central. Once again, the location of Bordeaux is on the Atlantic coast in the southwest of France. Let us have a look at some important key facts about Bordeaux, once again in comparison with Austria, where our university and the study program International Wine Business is located. First and most importantly, let's have a look at the size. It becomes obvious that Bordeaux is a huge wine growing area. It covers a surface area of 110,000 hectares. When we compare that with Austria, where the university is located, which is surrounded by the vineyards of Wachau, Kremstal, Kamptal, Traisental and others, so subdivided into many different small areas, it becomes obvious that the entire Austrian surface area is much smaller. We can therefore conclude that Bordeaux has more than double the amount of hectares, and this makes Bordeaux the biggest quality wine area on earth. We should not forget though that quality wine and table wine production or the production of simpler wine is different. So Bordeaux, for example, is not the biggest wine growing region of France. This is Languedoc-Roussillon. Languedoc-Roussillon has more than 200,000 hectares. But a lot of its surface area is dedicated to the production of vin de pays. That would be a simpler quality level of wine. So once again, 110,000 hectares makes Bordeaux the biggest production area of AOC wines, which are wines of a designated area of origin, or we could also say it's the biggest production area for quality wine on earth. We see that in terms of latitude, Bordeaux is obviously located further south than the wine area around Krems. So we are approximately on the 38th degree latitude north, and the latitude for Bordeaux is around 44, also north, but further south than the Austrian areas. In terms of altitude, it is obvious that Bordeaux is not a hilly or even mountainous landscape. It's a very flat land on the shores of the Atlantic, and on average we're only at 35 meters altitude. There are some areas around Bordeaux that needed to be drained, which means in the old days they were partly flooded with water and the land had to be drained to be plantable with vineyards. The average growing season temperature, obviously it's further south, is higher than in Austria, 18 degrees compared to 14.7, whereas the average rainfall is higher in Bordeaux. This is sometimes underestimated, that there's quite a lot of rainfall, and this has also quite an impact on viticulture. The rainfall, or the amount of rainfall, is sometimes underestimated, and it's quite a humid area on the Atlantic shore. Which brings us to typical viticultural hazards. For example, fungal diseases. The more humid the climate, the higher the risk of fungal diseases as well. Also, there can be hail in summer. There's not a big hazard of frost. So spring frost, late frost, this is normally not the case in the area of Bordeaux. The average production volume, of course this differs in different vintages, is approximately 5 million hectoliters. The principal grape varieties are Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, and also less Cabernet Franc. We have to note that 90% of the vineyard surface area is planted with grapes for red wine production. So the white grape varieties, Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and a tiny bit of Muscadel, they play a minor role. When we have a look at the info box, a lot of information is repeated from the key facts, but we have, for example, the number of inhabitants in the city of Bordeaux and its surroundings, with approximately 770,000, which gives us the information that there is also quite a big local market. And we have here the second important factor that influences viticulture in the area, and these are the three rivers. There is Garonne, Dordogne, and Gironde. Also mentioned here in the info box are the soil types, and here most importantly the gravel. So these are pebble stones that we find all around the area of Bordeaux. While gravel really dominates the wine area's soil type, there's also limestone, so chalky grounds in and around the area of Bordeaux, most importantly on the right bank. The climate here once again is rather humid, and it can be referred to, of course, as maritime. So it is influenced by the Atlantic Ocean very much. Important or interesting things to visit in Bordeaux are, of course, the chateaux themselves. A chateau is a wine growing facility which can be very luxurious and of extremely interesting architecture. But in Bordeaux, every winery is referred to as chateau. Doesn't have to be necessarily beautiful or architectural landscape. So it can be a simple building made of concrete as well, and it would be called chateau as well. Interesting to visit, of course, is also La Cité du Vin. This is one of the most important, I would say, biggest wine museums and experience centers in the world. It's a very modern building, including a wine shop, a restaurant, and of course tasting rooms and a lot of interactive exhibition stations where visitors can experience the wines of Bordeaux. Important to note is that Dordogne and Garonne, they kind of join each other and are then named Gironde, and the Gironde then flows into the Atlantic Ocean. The regions in Bordeaux, which are located on the southern or the southwestern side of Gironde, are referred to as left bank areas, most importantly the Médoc, and the areas located on the right-hand side or northeastern side are referred to as right bank or rive droite areas. These are most importantly Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. We will come to the details when we talk about the single AOCs later. Let us now come to the most important wine categories and/or AOCs and regions. So this is in French language. I will try to explain what these abbreviations also mean. The first and most important category or AOC is Bordeaux Rouge. So the RG stands for Rouge, and also very important Bordeaux Supérieur. By far the most important wine categories are Bordeaux and Bordeaux Supérieur. The RG standing for Rouge indicates that red wines are meant here. Also important is an AOC or category called Côte de Bordeaux. The areas on the left bank, as mentioned, they are located southwest of the Gironde, are most importantly Médoc and also partly Grave. On the right bank, rive droite, which is northeast of the Gironde, we find, for example, Saint-Emilion, Pomerol and Fronsac. They together make around 11% of the AOC area. Then we have simple dry whites, which are blanc sec, and we have a percentage of only 3% for the famous sweet wines of Bordeaux, which in French are blanc doux. Doux stands for sweet, blanc for white. This includes the world famous Sauterne. Let us now have a look into the more detailed areas on the left bank, the right bank and other wine growing areas. On the left bank, located southwest of the Gironde, we find the world famous appellations Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Margaux, Mouly and Listrac. Of course, the big areas Médoc and Haut-Médoc themselves. We find Pessac-Léognan, Grave and also Sauterne and Barzac. On the map, we can locate all these AOC areas in detail. Important to know for you is that left bank Bordeaux mostly consists of Médoc and Haut-Médoc and the world famous smaller appellations Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien and Margaux. On the right bank of Bordeaux area, once again called rive droite, we find Saint-Emilion, Pomerol, Fronsac and Castillon-Côte de Bordeaux areas. In terms of quality, by far the most important ones and the ones you should definitely remember are Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. In between the rivers Garonne and Dordogne, we find the region Entre deux mers. Entre deux mers would translate to in between two oceans, whereas it is in reality in between two rivers. Once again, the two, in terms of quantity, most important appellations are Bordeaux and Bordeaux Supérieur. The left bank of Bordeaux is in French rive gauche, and the right bank of Bordeaux is in French rive droite. This map now gives a beautiful, simplified overview of the wine regions of Bordeaux. On the left-hand side, so the left bank, which is west of the Gironde, we find the Médoc area with its smaller appellations mentioned earlier, including, for example, Margaux, Saint-Estèphe and Pauillac. With number 2, we find the area of Grave. Grave meaning literally gravel and standing for small pebble stones that are all over the area, and the vineyards consist of this type of stones and minerals. Number 3, as already mentioned, we find between Dordogne and Garonne, and this is the region Entre Deux Mers. With number 4, we find the internationally very famous sweet wine area Sauternes, here referred to as number 4, Vignoble de Sauternais, so the area of Sauternes. Number 5, internationally not so well known, as most of the wines which are from there are Bordeaux, Bordeaux Supérieur. Also, Libournais is sometimes mentioned on the label. That's Vignoble du Libournais. Last but not least, number 6, we have the wines from Côte de Blaye and Bourgois, and there we also find the small appellations and quality-wise extremely important ones, Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. So this map gives you an overview, but you should not forget it is simplified to make you understand, and the entire list of AOCs is much more complicated and of course more detailed in terms of differentiation. On this map we have a more detailed picture, so we have roughly the most important areas as well, but it also points out which AOCs are included in the sub-areas. I want to repeat the most important ones once again. On the left bank, so left of the Gironde, we have Médoc, Haut-Médoc, and the world famous areas or villages such as Saint-Estèphe, Saint-Julien, Margaux, and Pauillac. On the right bank, or rive droite, we have the world famous Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. For more detailed information, please read through all the single AOCs. It has to be mentioned that few of them are really of international importance, but you will find most of them mentioned on the label. Some are marketed as Bordeaux and Bordeaux Supérieur because this brand is well known and probably better known than some of the single AOCs. Let us now have a more closer look on the left bank of Bordeaux and its wines. Here we have a typical image of a chateau surrounded by its vineyards. So this is characteristic for Bordeaux, that it's not like in Burgundy, but also in Germany or in Austria, where the winemakers would have a small plot in this single vineyard and some rows of vines in another vineyard, and they have to drive to different hillsides to find their rows of wine. Normally there is a chateau surrounded by its vineyards, and we have here as an example Chateau Pichon Longueville surrounded by its AOC wines, and this makes it kind of easier to understand how the wine style of a chateau is in Bordeaux. Whereas compared to Burgundy, there may be one single vineyard plot owned by dozens of different winemakers, and we would have the name of the vineyard or the village written on the label, and many different wines each year. So with each vintage we can have 20, 30, 40 different single vineyard wines in Burgundy, whereas when we see Chateau Pichon Longueville, the first wine and the second wine, there is no other with that name. That makes Bordeaux easier to understand, and Bordeaux is also quite easy to understand in terms of grape varietals. The left bank is dominated by red wine blends made of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, with a little bit of Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot, whereas the right bank is dominated mostly by Merlot blends. So there's Merlot, which is the highest percentage, and then come other grape varieties. This is just a rule of thumb, but generally left bank wines are more dominated by the Cabernet, and right bank wines are more dominated by the Merlot. Let's have a closer look at world famous AOC Saint-Estèphe. It has a surface area of approximately 1,230 hectares, is dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon, and there's also Cabernet Franc and Merlot, of course. The wines are always blends. It would be really something extraordinary to have a single varietal wine. The soils in Saint-Estèphe are light upper soils on a layer of clay and limestone, and we also find the pebble stones, the gravel in that area, but there's always a layer of clay and limestone underneath. The most important producers, and the three of them are world famous, are Cos d'Estournel, Montrose and Calon-Ségur. To find out more on Saint-Estèphe and its wines, you can also click on the link to get to the Saint-Estèphe website. Pauillac is another world famous little town located on the left bank, rive gauche, of Bordeaux. The surface area is quite similar to the one of Saint-Estèphe, 1,200 hectares approximately. Here also Cabernet Sauvignon is dominating. There's also Merlot, and we find here tiny bits of Malbec still, although it's in terms of quantity not important, yeah? And Petit Verdot, which adds the spiciness to the blends. The soils are sandy, more sandy than in Saint-Estèphe, with small gravel stones. The world famous producers of Pauillac include Château Lafite Rothschild, Château Mouton Rothschild and Château Latour. All of the mentioned are first growth in Bordeaux. We will come to the appellations and the classification system in more detail later. To find out more, go to the webpage of pauillac.com. A bit smaller than the mentioned Pauillac and Saint-Estèphe is Saint-Julien. Saint-Julien has approximately 900 hectares, also dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon, and we find there as well Cabernet Franc and Merlot. Once again, gravel is dominating, and underneath we find clay and limestone soils. The producers are a bit lesser known and a bit lower in price. Therefore, we find Château du Cru Beaucaillou, we find Léoville-Barton and Château Léoville-Lascasse. The mentioned ones are not Premier Grand Cru, but they are well known and they are, as mentioned, less expensive, but nevertheless of high prestige and very sought for wines. To find out more, go to their webpage saintjulien.com. The appellation Margaux is probably one of the most famous in the world. It covers a surface area of approximately 1,500 hectares. Once again, this left bank wine region is dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon, and they have Merlot, of course, in their blends. And again, we find a tiny bit of Malbec and Petit Verdot. Also here, gravel dominates. Underneath we find limestone and silt on clay. The most important producers are, of course, Château Margaux, Château Palmer, and Rosan-Ségla. The Médoc area itself, where we find like small islands, the mentioned little towns or villages, covers a surface area of 5,500 hectares approximately. It is dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon once again, but in nearly all the blends we find a certain percentage of Merlot, which differs, can be 30%, can be 40%, but normally the higher percentage is Cabernet Sauvignon. Malbec and Petit Verdot once more plays a minor role, but is added in small percentages to give an extra flavor to the blends, and we know that Petit Verdot has this kind of spiciness that adds to the blends, and it's a tiny kind of ingredient, but an important one. Good for the Cabernet are, of course, the alluvial terraces of gravel. Yeah, the gravel makes a real specific terroir for the Cabernet. We know that Cabernet is a very late ripening grape variety, and that Bordeaux has quite a lot of rainfall, but 18 degrees Celsius on average season temperature. So all the Cabernet Sauvignons nowadays get ripe in the area. Important producers of the Médoc area are, for example, Château Portansac and La Tour Haute-Causant. The area referred to as Haut Médoc, which is the higher Médoc, might be a little bit confusing because it's not really high up in the hillside, but it's in terms of altitude basically the same. It's just location-wise called Haut Médoc, the higher Médoc, covers approximately 4,680 hectares. Once again, the soils good for Cabernet are the alluvial terraces with gravel deposits, and very well for planting Merlot are the deeper soils with more clay inside. In the Haut Médoc we find chateaux such as Saucian-d'Aumalé or Château Tronquoy-Lalande. Also considered to be part of the left bank of Bordeaux, we find the sweet wine areas Sauternes and Barzac. The surface area is approximately 1,560 hectares, and as it is a sweet wine area for white wine, we don't have a lot of Cabernet and Merlot there, but white grape varietals. Most importantly, we find Sauvignon Blanc and Sémillon. Muscadel has really a small percentage only. Important to note here is that Muscadel has nothing to do with the grape variety Muscat, in France also called Muscat au petit grain, which is in Austria and Germany known as Muscatella, and is basically known to be originally from Greece, where they call it Muscat. In Southern Europe and Southeastern Europe, they have Moscato wines, such as in Piedmont, or Muscat, we find also in Alsace, that has nothing to do with Muscadel. What is more, that Muscadel is not related to Muscadet. Muscadet or Muscadet Sèvres et Maine, both AOCs exist, are areas in the Loire Valley on the Atlantic coast. So Muscadet, Muscat and Muscadel are three totally different things. The soils we find in Sauternes and Barzac are mostly composed of gravel and pebble stones, which lay on limestone and clay veins. By far the most important producer is Château d'Yquem. Château d'Yquem is not only probably the world's best known sweet wine producer, it is also by far the most expensive sweet wine of Bordeaux. This Sauterne is known all over the world, and then we have to state that it's really a flagship wine, much more important and much more expensive than the rest of the wines of Sauterne and Barsac. We can even state that some wines of Sauterne and Barsac are relatively cheap for the price-quality ratio you get. Yquem is really the exception, and it is also the one and only sweet wine chateau in Bordeaux that is classified as Premier Grand Cru Classé. Let us now come to the right bank, rive droite of Bordeaux. Simplified, we find the two quality landmarks, Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. Lesser important, but still worth mentioning, is Fronsac. There are a lot of so-called satellites from Saint-Emilion. Examples are Montagne Saint-Emilion, Lussac Saint-Emilion and Saint-Georges Saint-Emilion, but they play a minor role in terms of importance and prestige. Saint-Emilion is not only a beautiful city with extremely interesting architectural sites, such as an église, a church which was carved into the stones. It is also quite a big appellation of origin. Saint-Emilion covers a Grand Cru surface area of 4,160 hectares and an Appellation Contrôlée, AOC area of 1,170 hectares. If you find this relation now a bit odd, that there is much more Grand Cru than Appellation Contrôlée, I have to agree. The problem is that the Grand Cru Saint-Emilion, you can also find wines of average quality and also not so highly priced that are rather disappointing. So it cannot be compared with the appellation system of the left bank. If you take a Medoc, a Haut-Medoc, a Pauillac, Saint-Julien, Saint-Estèphe, that is a classified Grand Cru, it is very reliable, has high prestige and normally a high price. This is not necessarily the case on the right bank in Saint-Emilion. We can generally say that Saint-Emilion wines are dominated by Merlot. In the blend, of course, we find also Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, but in general terms, Merlot is the dominating ingredient. We find limestone plateaus surrounded by chalky soils and clay loam texture. So there are also loamy soils that fit very well to Merlot. In the northwest of the area, we find more sandy soils. In the south, there are lighter soils formed by alluvial gravel and sand. In the south, we find lighter soils formed by alluvial gravel and sand. Compared to the big Saint-Emilion area and its so-called satellites, Pomerol Appellation Contrôlée is really small. Compared to Saint-Emilion and its so-called satellites, Pomerol Appellation Contrôlée is really a small area. It covers approximately 800 hectares and is dominated by Merlot. The soils are dominated by gravelly and sandy rock surfaces mixed with iron outsides known as crasse de fer. The world-famous producers include Château Petrus, Château Le Pin and La Fleur, and, for example, Vieux Château Certain. When we have a look at the map of France with the different temperature zones, it becomes clear that the country is very diverse when it comes to climate and temperatures. We see that Bordeaux is in a warm climatic zone, and it becomes even hot more towards the south. We find moderate temperature zones in Burgundy and even cool areas in the north of France. Concerning climate, it is important to note that global warming is also affecting the Bordeaux area and its wine production. When in the 1980s and also 1990s, the wines of Bordeaux had alcohol levels between 12 and 13, sometimes 13.5. Most Bordeaux wines, also the simpler ones, they have at least 14 volume% alcohol. When I worked as a sommelier in London in the early 2000s, we had the wines of the 1990s, of course, and our house Bordeaux had an alcohol level of 12. It had a very pleasant mouthfeel. It was not overwhelmed with body and boldness. It was even easy to drink. These wines can actually not be found any longer, unless you find old vintages, of course. But in general, global warming had an enormous impact on the wine styles of Bordeaux. They became darker, heavier, bolder, and I would say broader also in general, and they definitely became stronger, higher in alcohol. When we have a short look, very condensed, on the history of Bordeaux, it is really important to mention that the connection to Britain or England has always been very, very intense. In time periods, the area of Aquitaine was even British or English. So there were times when the English and British influence on the area was very big. There were times when those two houses were connected through marriage, and if they were not kind of together, they were at war with each other. So the history of the conflicts of Aquitaine and England and the history of the areas being united is something very exciting, and the French only took control over the area in 1453, but the English influence stayed until now in that area. Not that they own parts of the land, although there are English who purchased chateaus, but it still is a very, very important market for Bordeaux wines, and that is partly due to the historical fact that these areas were connected or at war with each other for a lot of periods in time. In the 15th century, there are new customers appearing on the scene, including the Dutch, that play a very important role in Bordeaux as they brought the knowledge how to drain lands that are on the shore and to make them fit to grow either crop or vines, to plant vines on those lands. on the drained lands. The Hanseatic League, or so-called Hanse, owned a huge fleet of ships and traded goods all over Germany, Scandinavia, Great Britain, the shores of the Atlantic coast of France, including Bordeaux wines. Finally, still, England being a very important trading partner for Bordeaux wines and also playing a very important role in the development of wines from Bordeaux. The so-called golden era of trade with Bordeaux wines and the golden era of Bordeaux becoming a world-famous regional brand started in the 17th century. The Dutch traders, as already mentioned, brought the knowledge to drain the marshland around the Medoc area, nowadays home of some of the prestigious wines on earth. The duties against French wine imports to England were more than twice as high than those leveled from Iberian peninsulas in the 18th century, and therefore this conflict between England and then already France became the trigger of English traders to discover other areas to import wines into Great Britain. And this is, for example, when the history and the success story of sherry started and of port wine. So sherry and port became big and became important producers due to the fact that at this period of time mentioned here, roughly 1700 to 1786, there was a conflict between France and England, and therefore there was a specific tax, a specific duty imposed on French wine, and most importantly wine from Bordeaux. Around 1700, the new French claret was born. Claret is a term that is typically used for Bordeaux wines still nowadays in England. Claret most likely comes from the French term claret, and claret is a term the French use for light red wine. So clair, which means not dark in color, and claret very likely come from a wine that has been red but not very intense in color. Why is now a new French claret born? It was discovered that when barrels were transported over the sea and over a longer period of time, it was better when it arrived than when it was filled into the barrel. So the new French claret had a slight influence of barrel aging, and it also became a little darker because color was intensified by leaving the juice ferment longer with the skins. The new French claret is therefore from the 18th century, and mostly in that time they found out about how to use barriques, so small oak barrels that had the advantage that it could be transported on ships. The French Revolution had a huge impact on ownership of wineries in Bordeaux. Before the French Revolution, the aristocratic families owned all the chateaux in the area, but with the revolution, citizens that had the financial means to purchase chateaux and to become owners appear on the scene, including, for example, the Rothschild family that became a first international player in the banking business. In the 19th century, throughout the so-called Second Empire, there were big investments made from outside Bordeaux. The family I already mentioned, the Rothschild family, for example, bought Château Lafite and Château Mouton. The year 1855 is very important for Bordeaux and wine history in general. The first official classifications of the best wines in Médoc was elaborated and released. The classification of 1855 is based on the sales prices. Back then they sold the wines by barrel, by barrique, and the wines that achieved the highest prices on the market were classified as Premier Grand Cru Classé, so the first growth, were the most expensive ones, because the idea behind was the wines that fetch the highest prices on the market, they are obviously the best. So 1855 is a real landmark in wine history, as it is one of the first classifications on earth, and it has to be mentioned that this Médoc classification still exists nowadays. There have been very, very little changes to that, and basically the classification of first, second, third, fourth, and so on growth, so crus, still exist nowadays. Another important time, in that case unfortunately very negative, was between 1875 and 1892, when the phylloxera arrived to the Bordeaux area. Phylloxera, as you know, is a little wine louse that eats the roots of vines, and in this short period of time mentioned here, the phylloxera devastated the entire vineyard area of Bordeaux. There was basically nothing left. Only with replanted vines that were grafted on American rootstocks, Bordeaux was then replanted again. In the so-called fin de siècle period, it is recorded in history that there were no real good vintages. So between 1900, 1920, there are no outstanding vintages. Also, a rapid expansion of areas under vine caused a fall in prices and a decline in quality. So a lot of areas in Bordeaux that used to be meadows for raising cattle, so there were cows on the meadows, they were planted with vines, some of them really not that much even suited to have viticulture there, and this caused problems because the vineyard area was expanding rapidly, too fast, and it caused a kind of problem with prices and brought a disharmony to the markets. What followed were political problems and of course World War I, World War II, which meant that it really was a difficult time that Bordeaux and also the rest of the world went through. After World War II, we see a quite fast recovery of Bordeaux as a wine growing area. Probably this is marked by the famous vintage of 1945, which still makes experts and enthusiasts absolutely stunned how well these wines can be kept over many, many decades. And in the 50s and 60s, Bordeaux re-achieved the prestige that it still has nowadays. It has to be said that in the 1990s, Bordeaux went through a kind of crisis area and the vineyard surface area was shrinking. There had to be vines removed, and now I think it's came to a point where it's quite stable. So it has to be mentioned that the prestigious chateaus, the very expensive wines of Bordeaux, they don't necessarily mean that all the wines of Bordeaux sell well. And it also does not mean that all the wines from Bordeaux are expensive and can be easily sold. So the area as well has a lot of different quality levels and price levels, and although it is one of the most important wine regions of the world, it doesn't mean that it sells itself. What was just mentioned, that Bordeaux, although it is the most famous wine region on earth, doesn't have problems, becomes clear in this graph. It is taken from a webpage of Chances Robinson and displays the surface area in hectares as well as the production volumes in hectoliters. Here we can see that the vineyard surface area saw a decrease in the time period 2006 to 2020, and therefore also the production, although we have of course different vintages and the weather and climate influences play a role, that it is actually going down. It is hard to say what happens in the future with Bordeaux, whether the production volumes will stay stable now. What has become clear, that also Bordeaux is not untouchable, that the competition from other countries that produce wines from similar grape varieties such as Chile, probably South Africa, and also Australia that has Cabernet and Merlot, they play an important role and are big competitors. And also Bordeaux in the lower price level is struggling to keep its markets and to sell the wines in these huge quantities. The grape varieties of Bordeaux are on the one hand its big advantage, as most of them are extremely well known to customers. On the other hand, they have been planted in so many other wine areas that these wines became somehow replaceable. Merlot is the most important and most planted varietal in Bordeaux. We find Merlot in basically every other wine country in the world. For example, in the Italian wine region Veneto, in the northeast of the country, we find a lot of Merlot planted, sold for very cheap prices, and they are sold in all supermarkets around Europe. We find Merlot in Chile, in South Africa, in Australia, also in Austria. The same with Cabernet Sauvignon, which is a very important grape variety in California, for example. So these famous varietals all come from Bordeaux and are now successful all over the world. Lesser important now in the area Bordeaux are the grape varieties Carmenère, Malbec and Petit Verdot. Interestingly, Malbec became very popular and famous in Argentina, and Carmenère became a signature varietal in Chile. The white grape varieties cover less than 10% of the vineyard surface area, and they are most importantly Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc, and a tiny little bit of Muscadelle is planted. As can be seen here, Merlot is absolutely dominating, especially in the cheaper wines such as Bordeaux and Bordeaux Supérieur. Merlot is mostly dominating the blend, whereas Cabernet Sauvignon is known as probably the most prestigious grape variety. It dominates on the left bank of Bordeaux, but is always let's say 90%, in a blend with Merlot and other grape varieties. Cabernet Franc covers approximately 10%, and other varietals altogether make only about 2%. For the white grape varieties, we have to repeat, they only cover about 10% of the surface area. Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc are very important. Mostly we find them in a blend. Single varietal Sauvignon or single varietal Semillon exist, but are really an exception. Muscadel, as already mentioned as well, plays a minor role and covers only 5% of the vineyard surface area. There is one interesting and historic graph that we definitely wanted to include in this presentation and show you. You see on the left-hand side of this graph old figures from the 1930s, and on the right-hand side recent figures of the 2000 and later. And here it becomes obvious that there were always big differences in production volumes, and it becomes obvious that Bordeaux has not always been a red wine dominated area. So in the 1930s there were periods in time when the production of white wine was higher or at least equal to the red wine production, and in more recent times, and we see here that production and vineyard surface area is decreasing, we see that red wine is definitely dominating. Let us have a look at the classification of Bordeaux wines. Growth is the English term for cru. A growth means basically a vine from a designated area of origin. By far the oldest classification in Bordeaux was implemented in the Médoc area. That's the left bank of Bordeaux. The classification of the Médoc area and its smaller AOCs was established in 1855, based on the wine sales prices by barrel at that time. This classification of 1855 is still valid and executed nowadays, and first, second, third growth and so on are based on sales prices from the year 1855. Nevertheless, this classification is very reliable. The higher the growth, first, for example, are most expensive, second growth a bit less expensive, we can really rely on this classification. First growth catch the highest prices also nowadays, and this classification became a kind of landmark for Bordeaux. In the area of Grave, the classification was implemented in 1953, in Saint-Emilion in 1954, and it was revised in 2012, and there are still ongoing tensions of chateaus whether they join or step out of this classification, so it's rather unreliable. And what is pretty stable are Cru Bourgeois, which refers to kind of the citizens' growth, or the growth of the bourgeois is actually a normal citizen. Let us have a closer look on the classification of the Médoc area of the year 1855, still in place and very valuable nowadays. As Premier Grand Cru classé, we have the following chateaus classified: Château Lafite Rothschild, Château Latour, Margaux, Moutot Rothschild, and Château Aubryon. These are still the signature chateaus and some of the most expensive wines on this planet. There are also second, third, fourth, fifth growth, and below that we would find the Cru Bourgeois. In the Sauternes area we find one landmark chateau, and that is, as already mentioned, a Premier Cru Supérieur, and this is Chateau d'Yquem. This Sauternes chateau fetches by far the most attention and highest prices in auctions, and all other chateaus are comparably cheap sweet wines of Sauternes. We find Premier Crus and Second Crus in this area as well. In this part of our Bordeaux wine tutorial, we want to talk a little bit about wine trade in Bordeaux, as it has quite some specific features. The trading structure in Bordeaux is different to other structures in different areas of European countries, and even different to the trade of wines in Burgundy. The trade in Bordeaux knows so-called wine brokers. The wine brokers, called courtiers, are the ones that directly get the wine from the chateaus. There are roughly 130 courtiers that cover about 85% of the business in Bordeaux, which means there are roughly only about 15% of the wines in Bordeaux that are marketed directly by the chateaus. For example, a bigger chateau or a cooperative might deliver directly to a supermarket chain. But this is really the minority. The vast majority, 85% of the deals, are handled through brokers. The brokers themselves, they generally sell to merchants. The wine merchants are négociants. And basically all Grand Cru wines and 70% of the rest of the wines from Bordeaux are going through this négociant level as well. It is estimated that there are about 400 négociants. These are the merchants, the traders, that then kind of deliver through their systems, which is called Place de Bordeaux, that's a very important term, to other wholesalers and traders, but also sometimes directly to restaurants all around the world. So these négociants, they ship the wines to retailers in over 160 countries in the world. 10% of those négociant companies, so about 44 companies, they make 84% of the entire revenues, which add up to approximately 3.3 billion euros. So this is a big business that is in the hand of few companies, some even say few families, and this trading system, the Place de Bordeaux system, is quite unique in the world. What is also unique in the world is the so-called en primeur system. En primeur means that you have to order as a retailer, let's say in Germany or in Austria or in Great Britain, your wines at the négociant before it is even bottled. There are en primeur tastings by experts who would then publish their ratings of the vintage that still rests in the barriques, and according to this, the consumers, the wine buyers, the end consumers, they can order, let's say pre-order, the wine at their local dealer. So for example, there's a fine wine dealing company all over Austria called Wein & Co. And if I would like to purchase the recent vintage, let's say when the en primeur tasting was done, and the points are given, and the experts would rate a vintage and specific chateaus, of course, as very high, I can place my order, which is called subscription, and I would subscribe a specific chateau, and when then it's bottled 1 year, 1.5 years later, I would get my wines. So you have to pre-order, you have to subscribe, you have to pay upfront, and when the wines are bottled, especially the Premier Grand Cru, but also second growth and third growth, people all over the world pre-order them, and when they're bottled, they would be delivered to the retailer, to the trader, and then finally the end consumer who has already paid for it receives the bottles. Also quite specific, of course not exclusive to Bordeaux wines, but totally dominated by Bordeaux wines, are wine auctions. We can of course find wine auctions around the world, nowadays mostly handled online by the way, that offer a lot of wines from Burgundy, from the United States, from Champagne or Champagne area, from the Loire Valley, but the auction scene is very, very much dominated historically and also in terms of price level by Bordeaux. In wine auctions you can find ripe Bordeaux wines. So for example, there are wine auctions where you can still nowadays purchase Bordeaux wines from the 60s, the 80s, the 90s. In some of these auctions, Bordeaux wines fetch really high prices. Normally in auctions, they would offer an entire case of wine. So this is a wooden box with 12 Bordeaux bottles inside. The higher the wine is rated, the higher the price will be that a case fetches. Important for auctions is the condition of the wine, and it can be stated that it is very, very difficult to state the condition of a wine inside a box, inside a bottle. One indicator is the fill level. So depending how much of the wine inside the bottle is evaporated, the purchaser tries to figure out how well the wine has been stored. The filling level reaches from high neck into lower shoulder. If you want to find out more about it, check in the internet fill levels or filling levels. When we look at a typical label of a Bordeaux wine, we find in 99% of the cases Chateau and then the name of the chateau. And this is important to mention because in Burgundy or also in the Loire and Rhone Valley, the producer as such plays a minor role. In biggest letters on a Burgundy wine, we would find the name of the village or the name of the single vineyard plot. But we said already that in Bordeaux, the vineyards are located around the production facility, so around the chateau. Therefore, the vineyard plot is automatically the one around the chateau. So, dominating a Bordeaux label is always the name of the chateau. Underneath, we find the mentioning of the AOC. This is the Appellation d'origine contrôlée. So we find the name of the designated appellation of origin. If a wine is from a famous town or village, it will be mentioned, such as Saint-Estèphe, Appellation d'origine contrôlée, or Pauillac AOC, or Saint-Estèphe AOC. If the wine is classified as Bordeaux or Bordeaux Supérieur, it will be stated as Bordeaux AOC or Bordeaux Supérieur. What is obligatory to be mentioned on the label, and Bordeaux wines often do not have a back label, so we find it also on the front label, are the filling content, so 0.75 liters for a standard bouteille or 1.5 for a magnum. And mandatory is also the alcohol level. So as mentioned, nowadays Bordeaux wines are full-bodied, rather heavy wines with 14.5 alcohol. This has to be stated on the label. In 99% of the cases, we will also find the vintage mentioned on the label. So if the wine inside the bottle was harvested in 2019, it's a 2019 vintage. Only older vintages from the 80s or 90s, and then mostly simpler wines, would not state the vintage on the label, but this is very, very rare. The influence on the vintage is extremely important when you want to age the wines and when you want to invest in a certain wine and you want to trade the wine. When you simply want to drink the wine and you purchase a Bordeaux up to, let's say, 15 euros or up to $20, then the vintage is actually not that important, because mostly the wine will not be aged. You purchase it from a supermarket and it's probably 4 or 5 years old, and every Bordeaux can age at least 5 years. If you want to purchase Bordeaux of a specific vintage, to keep it and to store it in a cellar or a specific wine fridge, because you want to keep it for certain celebrations, such as the birth of one of your children or the year you got married, then it is important to look into ratings and vintage tables. You find a lot of vintage tables in the internet where wine experts would rate a specific vintage of Bordeaux wines, and according to the points they give and also the explanation of a vintage, you can be rather sure that it can be aged for a very long time. They would also point out if the vintage was not that great, then it's rather not recommended to keep it for a very long time. When you purchase Bordeaux wines at a specific price point, I would say 50 euros plus, it's really incredible how long these wines can be aged. Of course, it always depends on the conditions. So in a very varied temperature, wines go bad rather quick. If the temperature is stable, although it's probably not ideal, which would be 14 to 18 degrees, you can keep a wine from Bordeaux at least 10 years from my experience.